Hey, I'm Bryson Carter. Today we're going to continue the basic principles of physiology. The first video we covered basic ideas of cell transport of ions and homeostasis. So now we're going to move on to action potentials, resting membrane potential, and the way that we're going to focus on particularly nerve cells on how they communicate. But this same principle, this concept goes along with every cell in the body, just to different degrees or different values. All right, so to start, we're just going to come up right here in this corner. This is an example. It's an imperfect example of the idea behind an electrochemical gradient. So we've got these two chambers, side A and side B, separated by a semi-permeable membrane. They have a solution with some ions dissolved in it. So we have 4 potassium ions on this side, 2 on this side, and 2 chloride ions on side A. What normal concentration gradients would say is that potassium wants to come onto this side, onto the right side. So there's that force of potassium wanting to get there to even itself out. And we covered a little bit of that with osmolarity in the last video, and tonicity. So potassium really wants to come over here because there's only 2 potassiums, but 4 on the other side. So that's the concentration gradient. That's the force pushing or motivating potassium to get them over here. But we've got an electrical gradient going on at the same time, because over here, and once again, this isn't a perfect system, but we have 2 chloride ions that are neutralizing the two of the potassium ions. So right now, the charges are just neutral, right, between the two. And so right now, the electrical gradient is happy, but that concentration gradient is strong. And so there's a balancing force between the two. So if the concentration gradient was stronger than the electrical gradient, then a potassium ion would come over here, and so now the concentration gradient is happy because there's 3 on that side, 3 on this side, but then the electrical gradient is not happy because there's really only 1 net positive charge on side A, while there are 3 net positive charges on side B when it comes to the assigned charges to the ions. And so what we do is we assign right here, the electrical gradients were the same, they were neutral, so we could just put like a 0 and 0 because they're neutral. But as soon as that concentration gradient shoves that potassium ion onto the other side, here where we were neutral, now we are lacking a positive charge. So we represent that by the negative symbol. So side A is now more negative compared to side B, because side B has 3 positively charged ions compared to side A, which only has 1 net positively charged ion. So now we're going to assign side B a positive value. This concept is crucial to understanding everything else with membrane potentials. So the word potential, think about it so potential energy, right? This is kind of an easy example. Because of gravity, this marker has potential energy, so that when I drop it, the gravity is going to shove it down. So roller coasters, once you are up at the top of the peak, gravity is going to shove you down the roller coaster. So that has a higher potential energy because it's not yet energy, but it has the potential to be that energy. Okay, so that's just a kind of a touch on potential. So right here, we would say that side B has an electrical potential to shove a potassium ion back to side A. But then the concentration gradient. Okay, so this electrochemical concentration gradients are created by charges and concentration. All right, moving on. This concept can be quantified, and a really smart person named Nernst, and probably a bunch of other people helped too, but Nernst came up with the Nernst equation, which quantifies how bad does this want to move, does this ion want to move, accounting for chemical gradients and electrical gradients. And so that's why the electrical gradient has to involve the charge of the ion. So that's what Z represents. So Z for potassium is +1. So if we were figuring out the Nernst for potassium, we would have to put a +1 in place for Z, and then throw in the log because that's what science does. But there's more important reasons for the log. But the concentrations come into play here because right here the concentrations were really basic and simple for us to understand, but they're a lot more complicated when it comes to the cell. So you have to know the two different sides of the system. So that's why there's concentration of X ion inside the cell or inside the system, and then there's concentration of X ion outside the system. So this Nernst equation accounts for how bad does it want to, or really like where does the where's the balance? That's it. So this gives us the Nernst potential, which is represented by EX, and that is the balance between chemical concentration and electrical force gradients. So the Nernst potential for each ion is different, specific to each ion, but it's also different specific to each system. So that's why muscle cells have a different resting membrane potential, and I'm throwing that word out there even though I haven't really discussed it, but that's why heart muscle cells have different compared to nerve cells resting membrane potential because they have different concentrations, different ions at play. Okay, so now let's go to driving force. So I should correct myself. The Nernst potential is just where the balance is between ion concentrations, between the chemical and the electrical gradients. Driving force, represented by dF here, is how badly it wants to achieve that end balance, that end value. So if you threw in some numbers here, I don't know what they are. I think it's something like 150 millimolar for potassium, and then we throw in Z plus 1. You don't really have to write +1. It's just implied when it's just a 1. Unless it's negative, then you put -1. So then the outside for potassium particularly of just a normal cell is a lot less than 150. I don't know what it is. I think it's something like 4 or something like that. 4.4. But these concentration gradients, if we plug this all in, we would get a value for potassium with respect to a nerve cell of -94 millivolts. All right, so that's the balance point when it comes to these particular concentrations. And once again, this is approximated. If you plug that into your calculator, you may get a different number, but I'm pretty sure it's around that value because this is the value for potassium. That's what in a nerve cell, that's what it wants to get to, balanced between concentrations and electrical forces at play. So the driving force, how badly it wants to get there, is determined all by Vm in this case, because -94 is kind of set. You plug that in right there. It's really important to include the negative and not assume that the negative as part of this equation, right? So you just got to put both of them. This Vm stands for the voltage of the membrane. So I'm going to just tell you this right now, and then we'll explain why it's like this. But for the membrane of a nerve cell, it is negative 70 millivolts. So negative 70 millivolts, then we just plug this into, we just plug and chug right now. A minus gives us a plus. So this gives us a driving force of positive 24. Now I wrote this always from inside the cell. What is always from inside the cell? Our reference of driving force is always with respect to from inside the cell. So that's going to make more sense when I explain it or show the example. Always from inside the cell, but then when it comes to deciding how badly that ion wants to get in or out of the cell, it comes to two things. The charge, the charge on the ion, and the charge of this driving force. So with respect to inside the cell, we know, so right here, look at the signs are the same. Same signs, plus and plus, they repel each other. Right? Opposite attracts. Opposites attract. And so, but since they're the same, plus and plus, and it's with respect from inside the cell, they want to repel each other. So potassium wants to leave the cell this badly, or this much, positive 24. Okay. Another example, I don't remember the calculations, but you can have, so sodium's, if we changed it right here, sodium on the outside of the cell has a lot higher, so this was the inside, so I don't know, let's put 10, and then on the outside it's a lot higher, so let's put 100, or I could put like 400, okay. So just throwing in some examples, I don't know what they are, but it calculates out to having a driving force of, let's see, I've just memorized this number right here. It's like negative 125, I think. So that's the driving force. I could take some time to figure it out, but for the sake of the video, so that's the driving force. Now let's compare, where does sodium want to go and how badly? Well, it's always from inside the cell, with respect to inside the cell. So, and then look at these two charges. Are they the same? No, they're opposite. The sodium has a plus, positive one charge, and then the driving force has a negative value out in front. So since they're opposites, does it want to leave the cell or come into the cell? It wants to come into the cell. And you can have help with knowing the direction of that by the concentration of sodium is always greater on the outside of the cell. So that's just an example. Last quick example to solidify that is chloride. So there are two varying the concentrations of chloride. You can get a negative 10 driving force or a positive 10 driving force. And in this case, you look at the signs, well, they are the same in this case. So a negative driving force, because it's the same of chloride, they want to repel each other, and it's with respect from inside the cell. So chloride in this case will not want to go into the cell, or if it's inside the cell, it will want to leave the cell. That's just specific for that one case. Well, vary the concentrations and etc. Sometimes you can get a positive driving force. In this case, since they're the opposite with respect from inside the cell, since they're opposite signs, they want to come together. So chloride in this case, the bottom case, wants to come into the cell this badly, 10. All right, so you'll remember that with sodium had a negative 125 driving force. So in other words, just that 125, that's a big value compared to these other values. That tells us that sodium really wants to get into the cell. And But what creates this concentration gradient? Primary active transport with ATP, that sodium-potassium pump, is always pumping 3 potassium ions inside the cell and then pumping 2 potassium ions outside the cell. So there's a massive concentration gradient of sodium going on, and it wants to get into the cell. Well, the cell has an established membrane potential of negative 70 millivolts. What does that mean? There are potassium leak channels that are they're always open. They're slowly, just gradually letting potassium leak. And like this example, when you saw that I put 1 potassium ion, when it passed through, well, it now created a negative charge on this side. Same thing here. Pretend this is side A and this is side B, okay? So as these potassium ions are leaving, this negative charge is being built up, okay? But we have a constant influx of potassium and a constant efflux of potassium, but they're not equal, okay? So that's why it balances out, we would think, at negative 94 millivolts, because that's what the balanced Nernst potential is for potassium. But turns out the cell is a lot more complex. There's a lot more ions happening. So it's almost negative 94. It's negative 70 millivolts. Okay, so that's what's established by this graph right here. Negative 70 millivolts is resting membrane potential, RMP. And that's because it's just slowly leaking out, right? All right, so now we're going to talk about a lot will be filled in as we talk about an action potential. All right, and this is exciting. This is mind-boggling. First of all, how we were able to learn this, and second of all, how the cells have created and become like this. Okay, this is a voltage-gated ion channel specific to sodium, okay? So a quick description of how this voltage-gated channel works. We've got negative charges. That's what we've established. Oh, I should throw this right here. Okay, so just like our system, negative and positive, we've got just a lot of those. Okay, so negative charges on the inner membrane. So this here is the inside of the membrane. This is the outside of the membrane. And we have a protein structure composed of amino acids. And we've got an alpha helix here with calcium ions in between, which calcium has a charge of +2. Normally, these stay shut, the voltage-gated ion channels for sodium stay shut by there being a positive charge, right? Net positive charge on the outer membrane. Positives repel positives, so there is a downward force on this spring, you could say, this alpha helix, which is attached to this door right here. Okay, think about a fulcrum. If there's more pressure right there, this end is right. It's being being kept closed. And then not only that, but there are negative charges right here, which positives and negatives are attracted to each other. So these calcium ions are attracted to the inside of the membrane being negative. So that's keeping the downward force here strong as well. Okay, so let's say I'm going to use this term, graded potential. I'm going to describe that later, but a graded potential happens, and somehow something positive enters the cell. And there's a lot of ways that can happen. Mechanical gated ion channels. Let's say that's kind of the easiest to grasp for now. Let's say I press down on this marker. As I press down, that opens up a a mechanical gated ion channel that's allowing a little bit of sodium to come into the cell. Well, sodium is positive, and there's a lot of it on the outside of the cell, so a lot of it's going to rush into the cell. And here at resting membrane potential, that's represented by like a graded potential, which is just like that, like a little bump. It's coming closer, it's more positive. On our y-axis, we've got the millivolts, x-axis, we've got our time. It's becoming more positive, but let's say it wasn't, like I'm just barely touching it and I'm closing my eyes, I can't, okay, like it's just not enough to fire the nerve. And I'll describe that with an action potential. But let's say that it is enough. I press hard enough, and that graded potential then reaches threshold. Now, why do we call it threshold? By definition, threshold means when the voltage-gated sodium channels open. Okay, that's what threshold means. And they open right around negative 55 millivolts. So it's still negative, but it's more positive than what we were at. Once they open, okay, that means that there's enough positive charges in here and I should say they're not just floating charges that, well, it's part of it is like positive ions, but also a part of it's just that magnetic, or sorry, the electrical field. Okay, so let's say that there's enough of this positive electric field in here. It's positives repel positives, right? And so this downward pressure is going to go away. And that puts, instead of downward pressure, now it's reversed. Now it's upward pressure. And then this, if I pull on this side, right, it's going to open up. Now, when it comes to this blob, I want you to think about a metal bracelet, the one that it's all stiff and elongated, and then when you press it, the warp removes itself and it wraps around your wrist. Okay, so that is kind of like this protein. So it's just strictly mechanical. As soon as this opens, something happens to cause this protein glob to snap shut. And just like that, it opens and it closes. But this is milliseconds, right? So there's a split second, literally split second in between, and there's a ton of sodium, right? That negative 125 driving force, tons of sodium on the outside. So a bunch rushes into the cell. Well, if more sodium is coming into the cell, this positive electric field is going to cause more of these sodium channels to open. Okay, so what do we see here when we're measuring the membrane potential? This is so cool, by the way. What we see is that graded potential, once it reaches threshold, or in other words, once it becomes positive enough for these voltage-gated ion channels to open, bam, it becomes positive really fast because all that sodium's rushing in. But remember the snapping shut of this protein glob, that it shuts. So that's why it doesn't continually get more and more positive. No, it shuts, and so then, oh, sad day, no more positives coming in. It's going to repolarize, which there's something that happens right here as well. It's going to come down here. And why does it repolarize or become more negative again? Well, right when these sodium voltage-gated sodium ion channels open up, what also open up are additional potassium leak channels. I'm going to draw that right here in blue. Okay, I'm not quite sure if you can see. Okay, you can. So as soon as this threshold is reached, these voltage-gated potassium leak channels, they're extra leak channels than just the regular leak channels, they begin to open up. And I'm going to draw them in several steps. So now maybe like one potassium ion's going through extra, okay, but then, and we're, as we move more longer in time, maybe by like right here, they are extra opened up. Okay, so now we're getting a lot of potassium going out. So that simultaneously happens as this opens and shuts. And so by the time we reach here, we are having more potassium leave the cell. Remember when one potassium left from side A to side B and it became negative? Well, now we're having a ton of potassium leave. So that's why it's becoming more negative really fast. This stage is called repolarization. This stage from here to here, that's depolarization, because it's depolarizing, no longer being opposites. It's getting closer to zero. So that stage is depolarization. This stage is repolarization. And then once there's resting membrane potential, that is where we want to be. Well, potassium's still leaving like crazy, so it's going to hyperpolarize. And then eventually those voltage-gated potassium channels shut, and now it's only the potassium leak channels, just the normal ones. And so then we come back and level out. Okay, so there are some terms right here. So I've covered graded potential. That's the slight influx of positive charge or positive electric field. If graded potentials are strong enough, they'll reach threshold, which causes depolarization. And then so depolarization occurs until this protein mechanically just snaps shut, closing these voltage-gated sodium ion channels. And then, so that's when they snap shut, repolarization happens because of these extra voltage-gated potassium leak channels happening. So then hyperpolarization occurs all the way down here because extra potassium is leaving the cell. And then now I need to cover what absolute refractory period is and relative refractory period. You can barely see that now. So coming in the x-axis, so let's say, I don't know what I don't know the actual value, but let's just say this is like 1 millisecond. There is a absolute refractory period, and that means that no matter how strong the stimulus is, no matter whatever the stimulus is, it cannot all of a sudden do this. It cannot all of a sudden depolarize, because if it's within this time frame. So it can't do this, right? It has to complete a full action potential, full cycle of depolarizing and repolarizing. But, sorry, I should draw it right there. Once we reach our resting membrane potential, this is considered from here to here the relative refractory period. So absolute refractory period, no signal, no matter how strong the stimulus is, no signal can cause depolarization. From here to here. Relative refractory period, from here to here, it's depolarization can occur, but it needs to be a really strong stimulus. And because we're more negative than normal when in this hyperpolarization period. So that's what relative refractory period is. Paintballers, they how fast you can pull the trigger is how successful you are sometimes in a paintball fight. So you can only pull your fingers so fast because of this relative refractory period. And then say you have a massage gun, those at a certain frequency of pounding, people just don't feel it because it's too high of a frequency. You're dealing with absolute refractory periods, and there's no firing of the nerves to say, oh yeah, it'll just feel like someone's putting pressure on you instead of the massage that you want. Okay, so the important part about absolute refractory period is this causes direction, okay? That's why, I can move it this way and my arm this way because the nerves, sent the signal down and it went like that instead of being confused of which direction to go. Okay, because once one nerve cell depolarizes and then repolarizes, it's going to go to the next nerve cell, and because of that absolute refractory period. Okay, now that I've beat the dead horse right there, we're going to move on. Let me just make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay. So I've kept it kind of basic. I haven't really spoken about what calcium does, like what would happen if we had hypocalcemia, like less calcium in the blood, or more. But you can imagine that a lot of problems will come to the functioning of a nerve cell and of other cells by imbalances in ions. So that's why, in the cardiac arrest algorithms, they check their H's and T's. A lot of them, like hyperkalemia or hypokalemia, has to do with how much potassium there is in the cell and whatever. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong. Obviously, if there are not enough calcium ions, then this voltage-gated sodium channel can pop open a lot easier. Different things like that would change the threshold. That would okay, so there's a lot more about that I'm not going to cover. I'm going to cover now the idea behind length constants and myelin. So right here, there's a way to decide how fast can a signal travel. Well, there are two things that influence how fast that signal travels. One of them is how easily ions can get in and out of the membrane, so permeability, and they call that resistance of the membrane. So if the resistance of the membrane, we would say that's having to do with the permeability of the membrane. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Ri is the resistance of the inside of the cell. So resistance inside and resistance of the membrane. Okay. It's a little bit confusing when I say resistance of the membrane, and you'll see why. But inside the cell, so pretend like this is a nerve cell, right? This is our phospholipid bilayer membrane, right? There's some channels here, ion channels. Well, and let's just say that a sodium channel opens up and a big positive, I should really draw this on this side. So let's say that a lot of influx of sodium ions came in. So this positive influence, a graded potential that reaches threshold, occurs. Well, how far is that going to travel down this nerve, and how fast? We want to know. That's represented by lambda, and it's this equation of the square root of Rm over Ri. Well, Ri, the resistance of the inside of the cell, if there's a bunch of proteins that are negative, then that will take up some of this positive field, or this positive force that's entered the cell because of this sodium voltage gated ion channel. So if there's a lot of these, well, I shouldn't say a lot. Let's say that there's just a normal amount, right? So we've got 4 proteins that are negative in this nerve. And then down here, and it's a thick, pretty wide nerve. Down here we've got a thinner nerve, but it has the same amount of proteins, let's just say, and they're the same size. Less about the amount, but more about the size. They're the same size proteins. Well, here there's more space. There's less. Yeah, there's more space for that positive influence, that electric field to move, which would cause more sodium channels to open up, causing more of a stronger presence of that field to move down. But in a thin nerve, when there's not so much space to work with, and we've still got those same sized proteins, that's going to take a lot more effort. So the Ri would be higher in this thinner nerve. It's kind of cool to think about, like big nerves in your legs that you can't draw. Well, I mean, there are people that can, but you can't draw a nice painting with your toes because you've got more of those like gross motor movements because they're bigger nerves. They require less signals, less of a stimulus to cause a signal to happen. Whereas the little nerves in our fingers, the fine motor skills that we have, because of the little nerves, they require a stronger stimulus. It's just kind of cool connections and so the stronger stimulus, more precise you can be. It's cool to draw those lines or ties, but that's what Ri is. So Rm is how you will have a high Rm if you can have a lot of permeability. So if potassium can leave the cell really easily, your Rm will be high. So our length constant, we want a big number because that shows us how far. That's how far we, or the bigger the length constant, the bigger lambda is, the farther and the faster we go as signals are sent. Well, they did this calculations and something about calculations. Oh, and also, negatives on the inside of the membrane also slow down that. They consume some of that positive force field. So they did some calculations, and just by the nerve alone of all the different negative solutes inside the cell and the negative inner membrane, we would need to have something like a nerve, the width like 6 to 8 inches, the width of a tree, the trunk of a tree, as our spinal nerve, to send signals as fast as we do send signals. So they were like, well, what's going on? There's more to the picture, and we have to send signals faster than that, and we do, and it's because of myelin. Okay, we are almost done. But this is a really cool part too. It just keeps getting cooler. So myelin, in the central nervous system, they're called oligodendrocytes, and in the peripheral nervous system, they're called Schwann cells. Okay, I'm not sure why the difference, but I'll learn that eventually. So you got to think about capacitance. Capacitance, it's kind of hard to describe it, but here we have a capacitor is something that stores charge, and it requires two electrodes, like two electric plates, and then an insulator. Okay, so they're useful in a lot of electronic systems and stuff like that, but I'm not very familiar with all that. But the idea of capacitance is how many charges per volt can we store. And so the smaller, this is an important relationship to kind of grasp right now, the smaller or the thinner the insulator, the more charge it can store when compared to those same plates with a thicker insulator in between. So this will store less charge, and this will store more charge. Now, put that in your pocket and we'll come back to it in a second. Let's say, okay, well, first of all, right here, potassium leak channels. Voltage-gated potassium leak channels. So potassium wants to leave the cell because of the concentration gradient, and but there are already positives outside the cell because of that potassium that's leaving already, and other things. And so these positives are likely to repel, just like two positive ends of a magnet, repel and keep that potassium inside the cell. We've got a concentration gradient pushing that outside the cell, but then we have these positive charges on the outside of the cell that are pushing it back inside the cell. So we've got this battle, and that's why, and sometimes it wins, and so the potassium comes out. Well, the potassium was like, well, I was just being bullied, so I'm going to go bully more people or more potassiums. So now there's more positive charges, and it's becoming harder for the next potassium ion that still wants to leave because of the concentration gradient. Okay, so what I just described there is Rm. So is it very permeable to potassium in this case? No, because there's a lot of charges out here per volt, or in other words, there's and you could say that this, how badly, like the volt is the pressure of potassium being pushed out of the cell. So there's a lot of charges per volt. So we could just throw in some numbers here. Let's just say 50 to 1. Capacitance is high, right? That's 50 charges per volt. It's high capacitance here. And that is reducing the permeability of the membrane to potassium, which causes less potassium to leave, okay? Now, coming back to this, remember how this hyperpolarization, the more it got more negative, that is when potassium leaves. And so the harder potassium has, the harder it is for potassium to leave, the more positive it is, the less it stays negative. Okay, so, but when it comes to myelin, I think there's a little bit of confusion there, but it's a weeds question. So when it comes to myelin, though, myelin is like this. It's a greater insulator between these two charges. And so because of that, there's less charge on the membrane right here, which allows potassium to leave the cell more, or to leave the cell faster. And there's also less positives pushing down on that potassium, so potassium has an easier time to leave. And there are also less negatives on the inside of the cell. Those two distinctions are really important. So Rm is increasing with myelin, and Ri is decreasing with myelin because there are, compared to here, when there's a lot of negative charges right here, but then there are fewer negative charges here. So the more negatives there are inside, the higher Ri is. Okay? And so since there are fewer negative charges, then Ri is not so high, it's lower. So when we have a small number in our denominator and a big number in our numerator, that gives us a big number. In other words, our length constant is higher, which means that a signal that comes from an influx of sodium, this positive field, yes, there are still some negative proteins in there, but once it reaches this myelin, it can travel further because there are fewer negatives on the outside, and there are more potassiums leaving the cell, which causes it to repolarize faster, allowing signals to be sent faster. A lot of signals to be sent faster. All right, so there's a mouthful. I am really confident that it's like 90% correct. So I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. You will enjoy a lot more when you grasp it. And let me just double check to make sure I got everything that I wanted to cover. Okay, I did. So that's it.